it is exactly time now.
Okay, so greetings everyone. We will start with our unit 28 already on bilateral agreements. And I will briefly introduce our speakers today. We have the honor of having two speakers. Dr. Monica Jacobo has a PhD in public policy and international development from the University of Pittsburgh and a BA in international relations and political science from the Center for Economic Research and Teaching. She is assistant professor at CIDE in Mexico. Her work examines the interactions between migration and education, in particular, how the migration trajectory impacts school access, inclusion, learning, educational achievement, identity formation, and future expectation. Her research is interdisciplinary and combines the study of migration, public policy, and the sociology of education and political science. She is a member of the National System of Researcher in Mexico, Level 1. She currently coordinates the project Young Migrants of Return, Educational Trajectories in Labor Insertion Expectations, with funding from the National Science Foundation here in Mexico, and the Migrant Childhood and Adolescence Diploma in the Americas at the Institute of Anthropological Research at UNAM, the National Autonomous University of Mexico. And then we have Marcelino Miranda. Some of you maybe already know Marcelino. He is a lawyer, political scientist, and a Mexican career diplomat. He is currently Deputy Director General for Legal Affairs at Mexico's Foreign Ministry. He has been posted as diplomat at the Embassy of Mexico in Belize and the Consulate of Mexico in Chicago, the US, as well as Director of the International Education at Mexico's Foreign Ministry. He has a Master in Comparative Democratization at the University of Essex, UK, and a Bachelor of Law from the National University in Mexico. So we are really happy to have you here, and please go ahead. I know Professor Miranda will start first.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Camelia. And I'm very happy to be here, and I appreciate the invitation to share some of my experience at the consulate, at the consular work. As you know, let me just, I'm going to first mention what is the dimension of the consular work of Mexico in the US, and I'm going to take it as an example in order to illustrate how the bilateral agreements work in consular work of Mexico in the US. And so I'm going to start just briefly by describing how the situation of Mexicans in the US, and then after that, I'm going to talk about the bilateral agreements between Mexico and the consulates and at government agencies. And then I'm going to describe those bilateral agreements that we have with NGOs. And then finally, with other consulates that we have, in order to illustrate the work that we have at the consulates. Let me first say that Mexico has a population of 126 million people. And in the US, that is, we share a huge border. In the US, there are approximately 15 million people, Mexicans living in the US. That would mean like 10% of the Mexican population. And it's also calculated there are 30 million Mexican descendants in the US. So that means that there's a huge population of Mexicans in the US, and that forced, in a way, Mexican government to establish a huge consulate network in the US. Currently, we have 50 Mexican consulates in the US. This is the biggest consular network of one country in another country. So that illustrates the importance of not only of the Mexican population, but also the priority that the Mexican government has set on attending and also providing services to Mexicans in the US. the population of Mexican of Mexicans in the U.S. is very diverse, and it's very complex. We have sectors of that population that work at the agricultural sector, but also we have at the same time highly skilled professionals who are working in different, especially in the service industry in the US. So we have a very diverse. We have a huge population of young people, of children, but at the same time elderly and middle-aged people working at the US. We have our population is split between women and men. We have all kind of needs from this population. So therefore, the services that are provided in the consulates are also very diverse. And at the consulates, we provide services on everything, from providing passports to providing, and we have different programs on health, labor, education, financial literacy, specific programs for women and children. So we have a huge range of programs. But the main what I want to emphasize is that what are those bilateral agreements that are helping us in providing these services. And obviously, as everybody knows, the Vienna Convention on Consular Relations is the main framework of our work, of the work of any consulate in another country. But in this framework, in this legal framework, what the Mexican government has done is that we have established a different, or we have signed different bilateral agreements that multiply or enlarge the efforts of our consulates. And let me tell you that the Vienna Convention on Consular Relations, it's a very powerful tool that the consulates have. And every country decides how far they want to go with using this Vienna Convention. And so the way in which we work in another country, or the way in which we use the consulates, it depends on political will, and it depends on the programs of every country. So there are countries who have limited amount of services in their consulates, and there are other countries who have expanded the range of activities and services that they provide to their nationals in another country. In this case, one of the strategies of the Mexican government has been to establish different agreements with different actors within the US. One of them is a very well-established agreement with government agencies in the US. And not only at the federal level, but also we have agreements with local governments. I would like to emphasize that, for example, with the federal government in the US, we have agreements with the Labor Department. And it has been a very good experience with the Labor Department, because every consulate has agreements with the local office of the Federal Labor Department. And what we do with those agreements is that we collaborate in order to defend the labor rights of our Mexican nationals in the US. That has been very successful. We have worked for more than probably 20 years in something that, for example, that we call the Labor Week or Labor Rights Week. This is 1 week in which around Labor Day in the US, in which we work extensively in providing for workers in the US, along with the federal authorities in labor. So that has worked very well. It has been surprising how working with each administration is in place in the US or in Mexico is a well-established bilateral agreement in which we have been working very well. And it has been very successful in to provide information to workers, Mexican workers in the US, but also at the same time providing legal services, legal protection, and even to take into some of them to court in order to defend their services, their rights. Another successful story has been agreements that we have with local authorities, especially in regarding women and children. As you know, in the US, the protection of women and children are regulated at the local level. So each our consulates have different agreements with the local authorities on children and women. So that also is the same work that we have at the local level. We have established these agreements, and that we do is that we work specifically in certain areas in order to protect the rights of children in the US. And also we participate as a consulate, we participate with NGOs also in order, and local attorneys, in order to provide legal services to those people who are in need, who don't have the resources to pay for a lawyer in the US. And also we work closely with local authorities in order to protect the rights of women and children. So I would mention those as very successful examples in which our consulates have been working with local authorities in the local and federal authorities in the US. Another, let me now mention what we do with NGOs. With NGOs in the US, they have been a powerful allies in order to protect the rights of Mexicans in the US. And we also do the same thing. We sign bilateral agreements with, we sign these agreements. There are different configurations, different legal configurations of these agreements that we have. We sign agreements with NGOs, local NGOs. There are some national NGOs in the US, and also with churches and religious organizations. Have been very successful because in the case of Mexicans in the US, they tend to resort to churches in order to look for, to seek for protection of the rights. That's the natural tendency of Mexicans. They trust churches and religious organizations, so they look for assistance. So we have agreements with NGOs, churches, and religious organizations, and we work together, all of us, at the same time, in order to provide legal assistance to Mexicans in the US. These agreements that we have depend on the subject. With these NGOs, we have specific agreements on protecting human rights, or, for example, rights of women, or labor rights, or immigration regarding immigration law. As I mentioned at the beginning, the Mexican community is very diverse, so the kind of legal services that they need are very different. So I would like to emphasize this. What we do is that we agree that we are going to provide mutual assistance. That means that when we have a Mexican who needs legal assistance or any other kind of assistance, we call the NGO, and then together we provide different assistance to those Mexicans. At the same time, the NGOs also have this agreement in which whenever they know that they have a Mexican national who needs assistance, they call the consulate in order to provide in a coordinated way to provide assistance to that person. So we have a holistic approach in which whenever it's needed, we work together with the NGO, but at the same time, sometimes we call local federal authorities in order to complement and to coordinate the work in protecting the rights of these Mexican nationals. The third the third actor that I would like to mention that we have agreements is with other consulates, the consulates of other countries. We have there a very successful story about we decided to join with Central American countries. They have also consulates. They have smaller network in the US. But what we do is that we sign an agreement with those countries in Washington, D.C., in order to coordinate the work, in order to provide mutual assistance. What we decided is that we were going to join forces, and also we were going to share our, I would say, our network of partners in the US. I mean, the federal authorities, local authorities, NGOs, churches. So we shared that those contacts that we have. And then what we decided is that whenever we had, for example, local workshops to provide legal assistance, we invited the communities not only of Mexicans, but also of different Central American countries like Salvadoranians, Hondurans, Guatemalan nationals. So that was another successful story in which we signed this agreement and then we joined forces. Also at some certain cities in the US, we also signed these agreements with the local or the consulates, the consulates of these Central American countries who had an office in those cities. So we signed agreements in Chicago, in Los Angeles, in Texas. So we identify where there were these different consulates, and we signed these agreements. And so that was another successful story because we joined forces and we coordinated at work. Let me mention a little bit more. I just have a few minutes, just to illustrate how it works on the ground. For example, in the kind of labor rights, we have had different cases. One of them in Chicago is that, for example, we identified that at certain restaurants there were some Mexican workers who were also like in slavery conditions. It was awful, and it was very worrying. And so the thing is that here we work together with the local labor authorities and also with the local general attorney's office in Illinois, in the state of Illinois, where Chicago is, in order not only to prosecute these cases, but also to provide assistance to the victims. So we work together with the local authorities. We also work with the immigration authorities, because those people who were also almost in slavery conditions, they were undocumented in the US. So that makes things more difficult, because obviously they didn't want to come out and to denounce or to report these abuses, these rights abuses. And at the same time, we worked with NGOs, some NGOs that were going to provide assistance, more kind of humanitarian assistance to these workers. And so what we did is that we were working closely with federal and local authorities in order to provide this assistance and to also gather all the evidence that was possible in order to prosecute the cases. I was very successful. And then at the same time, that allowed the cooperation of the Mexican consulate and also of these workers, that allowed local authorities to combat these terrible conditions, labor conditions of workers in these restaurants in Chicago. And also at the same time, they were able to negotiate in general with restaurants in certain areas in order to guarantee that of no repetition of these practices, and to avoid and to prevent these labor abuses. So that I would say that's one of the clear examples of the way in which these agreements work. They are very useful, and it depends on how far consulates want to go with these agreements. Those agreements are very good framework for the actions that consulates can take in another country. And then the other one, I think I have a couple of minutes, Camelia, I think. And just let me mention another example in which these agreements work. We have, as I mentioned, we have agreements at the local level in order to protect children and women. And in the time I spent in Chicago, we have different cases in which the custody of Mexican children was taken away from parents, Mexican parents, who most of the times were undocumented. Parents didn't understand very well certain rules and certain parts of the law in the US. Therefore, they made some mistakes. And so local authorities decided to withdraw the custody of their children and separate them from the children for different reasons. The problem here is that those parents didn't have any clue about how the law works in the US. Obviously, they didn't have money to pay for private attorneys. There were not. They didn't know that there were some legal services that they could get. And the other thing is that, unfortunately, there were some public officials at the local level who didn't know that they had to contact the Mexican consulate. So that what we did is exactly using these agreements in order to establish a direct communication with local authorities and also with NGOs, and that allows us to use our consular powers, I would say, that our consular immunity and the Vienna Convention on Consular Relations, in order to exercise a little bit of, I would say, a little bit of force, or to push a little bit the protection of the rights of the parents by using our consular powers, and also to use the agreements in order for local authorities to provide all the legal assistance possible to these parents. In the end, fortunately, we succeeded. We allowed many parents to recover the custody of the children, to stop separation of families, and then we put them together again, thanks to the participation of and the cooperation of local authorities, but also the cooperation of NGOs and other actors and attorneys in the US. So I would like to stop here, Camelia, and I hope that this could open a further discussion or more questions. And
Yes.
and I appreciate your attention.
Thank you so much, and thank you for giving us so many significant examples from your work. We will now proceed to the second part of our class and then go to questions and answers in about 25 minutes. So Monica, please go ahead.
Thank you, Camelia, and thank you so much, Marcelino, for introducing the topic of how complex is Mexican migration in the US. And in order to make this presentation comprehensive for our assistants, I would like to now speak about what happens with all these Mexican immigrants that used to live for many years in the US, and suddenly they have to come back to Mexico for many reasons. What kind of necessities they have for reintegration in Mexico, and what type of cooperation and bilateral agreements can Mexico and the US engage in order to provide better services for this migrant population. So as Marcelino already said, Mexican migration in the US is very complex. I would like just to highlight one thing that Marcelino already said, but I don't know how familiar are you with the issue of Mexican migrants in the US, but it's a flow that has been existing historically for decades, even for more than a century. And its nature is basically undocumented. Most of our Mexican migrants in the US are unauthorized. They don't have papers to stay there legally, even though we also have a share of that population that are legal residents that are highly qualified. However, most of our migrants in the US are in a different situation, which is very precarious. And what happened over the last decade is a change that has been dramatically transformed the nature of Mexicans in the US. We used to think of the US-Mexican migration as something that has been there for ages, right? We have more than 130 years of continuous flows going north. With a huge volume, as already Marcelino said, we have about 15 million Mexicans in the US, but if we add to that number the second generation and the third generation, in this case, the children and the grandchildren of Mexican migrants, we can sum up to 50 million of immigrants of a Mexican descent in that country. However, in Mexico, local authorities, federal authorities, and even scholars used to think of these migrants in the US as people that used to go and then come back to Mexico. Some of them will establish for some time in the US, but usually there was a change in the pattern around the 1990s in the last century, when, as a consequence for many anti-immigrant legislation, Mexican migrants started to establishing in the US. In other words, given a very anti-immigrant legislation, most of our Mexican migrants didn't come back to Mexico. They just started to bring their families to the US and establish there. And some of them even have children in the US, as some of the examples Marcelino gave you. The US-born children of Mexican migrants has been a population that has been growing recently in the US. So, as I already said, we used to have this go and back and forth between the border. However, we experienced a dramatical change in the last decade. During the 21st century specifically, we have, as you many may remember, we have a world financial crisis during the last presidency of Barack Obama. And basically we have a very hard impact on the Mexican immigrant population in the US after this crisis. Many of our immigrants started to come back to Mexico as an economic strategy to survive. Also, we have at the same temporal period a strengthening of the US deportation system and also a strengthening of the anti-immigrant legislation. All of these during the Obama administrations. And this is something that people who are not involved in immigration issues kind of get surprised when we academics say that most of our deportations started during the Obama period, because most people relate anti-immigrant legislation with Donald Trump. However, this change in the deportation system started and was actually set down by the Obama administration. And only during the two administrations of this president, we have over 2 million of Mexicans deported. And even though this number may sound really big, we think that is an underestimation, because sometimes when a family member was deported, maybe a father or a mother, that has to come back to Mexico, the entire family will follow that member. You know, if they have children that are minor and they are economically dependent on their other parents, they will have to come back to Mexico as well. And this used to happen also with the US-born children of Mexican immigrants. For many of them, they never had the experience of being in Mexico before, and this has face very difficult challenges for the Mexican government and also for the US government, because US born children of Mexican immigrants are a shared population where both US and Mexico have legal responsibilities. So in this presentation, I would like to talk specifically about this binational and bicultural population that now lives in Mexico, and specifically about some of the challenges that they have been facing in order to access their rights here in Mexico, even though they are Mexican as well. Because they have the right to the citizenship because they are children of at least one Mexican parent, sometimes the access to very basic education services or health or even other basic services get complicated here because they don't have one single document that can prove his identity or her identity as Mexican. Because they were born in the US, they have a US birth certificate, but that birth certificate is many times not considered valid here in Mexico in order to access services. So just like a very short note on how we understand return migration, scholars, basically it means all those people that were international migrants and that they leave their country of origin at some point in their lives and that now are back in their country of origin. Some concepts emphasize how long they need to be outside their home country in order to be considered return migrants, and other definitions emphasize that they need to have the intention to stay in their home country in order to be considered return migrants. However, here I just wanted to say that is whoever migrant who stay for some period outside their home country and that now are come back to that home country. Obviously, that return can be forced or can be voluntary. The return is forced when the country of destination, through a law or through a deportation order, requires that immigrant to leave the country. For the Mexican case, and given the highly undocumented natures of Mexican migrants in the US, forced return has been one of the main characteristics of our returning migrants in this century. Basically, we have over 2 million of Mexican migrants that have been deported, mostly during the first decade of the 21st century. And we also have a share of voluntary migrants that have been, in many cases, accompanying these deportees. And as I said before, we also have the US born children of Mexican migrants coming back from Mexico. And in 2015, we don't have still this number for the 2020 census. We have over 500,000 US born children living already here in Mexico. And we think that this population has been growing dramatically in this century. If you want to see this graphically, this is a really nice picture where you can see, I'm sorry I didn't translate this part, but if you consider how has been behaving the flow of Mexican migrants coming back from Mexico, from the US, you can see how levels in 1990 were relatively low because most Mexicans used to be established with their families in the US, but how this level grows in 2000 and how we have a huge peak in 2010 during the first presidency of Barack Obama, then it's still higher than the levels in 2020, but goes slower after during the second presidency of Obama. And then we have a peak down during Trump and during the current presidency of Biden. If you want to compare just how this return of Mexicans has been behaving in relation to the flow of Mexicans going to the US. You can see this blue line. This is the immigration of Mexicans to the US, and you can see this huge difference in 1990, where there used to be more Mexicans that go to the US than Mexicans that come back from the US to Mexico. And then you see how in 2010, this trend inverted. We have more Mexicans coming back from the US than Mexicans going to the US. And this graph is just to share graphically how the population of US-born children of Mexican migrants living in Mexico has been growing over the last 15, 20 years. In order to discuss how complex are now the challenges as the Mexican federal government and also local governments are facing, I would like you to think about all the different bilateral agreements that Marcelino already talked to you about, that they are a reflection of the many different policy needs and reintegration and integration needs that Mexican migrants have in the US. When you think of the returning flow to Mexico and their reintegration needs, it's very important to consider that the complexity that you used to see in the US now is reflecting in Mexico. In that sense, we have very different profiles of Mexican returnees living now here. We have children, we have elderly migrants who are here without a pension or a retirement plan. We have many people who have a very serious illnesses and didn't have any access to healthcare. We have people who are young and they need to reintegrate easily and soon into the labor force. We have many people with some type of education training in the US that are not being able to transfer those knowledge or at least to make valid those knowledge in Mexico in order to continue their education or in order to enter into the labor force. So it's very, very complex, this diversity of reintegration needs, but I wanted just to focus on the specific necessities of the children of immigrants. And here I like to talk about a specific bilateral agreement that has been recently made by the equivalent of the Ministry of the Interior of the Mexican government and also NGO, US NGO, that is in charge of providing this birth certificates for children who are born in the US. So in order to understand this bilateral agreement, which is my only example here, I would like you to see only a couple of minutes of this video. Let me go, and that will be pretty much the last part of the presentation in order to start discussion. Let me see. We're just gonna watch the first 2 minutes.
Eric and Kimberly live in Morelos, Mexico, with their parents, sister, and cousin. It's Easter, and they're spending the day at the park while the adults try to make a little extra money. They were both born in California, making them U.S. citizens, but were forced to move to Mexico 8 years ago after their mother, Maria, was detained and deported.
¿Quién le puso los patines al niño? Y están al revés.
¿Se consideran estadounidenses y mexicanos?
Sí, estadounidenses y mexicanos.
Technically, they are both, because any child born to a Mexican parent has the right to Mexican citizenship. The problem is they can't claim that right because they don't have Mexican birth certificates. Their mother didn't get them from the Mexican consulate in California when they were born. As an undocumented immigrant, she was scared of going to any government building. Without those certificates, Eric and Kimberly aren't guaranteed access to all sorts of public services in Mexico, like education and free universal health care.
Si ellos no tienen ya su doble nacionalidad terminando la secundaria, ellos ya no pueden ir a la prepa.
¿Has tratado de cambiar eso, de conseguir las actas, los documentos?
Pues ahorita, pues es lo que voy a verlo.
Eric and Kimberly's problem isn't unique.
Ayúdame a hacer una salsita para combinar.
Priscila and her brother Brian live with their grandparents in Morelos. And they don't have Mexican birth certificates either. It's made it hard to care for Brian, who suffers from asthma.
Ya veo que las cosas son un poco difíciles para la familia.
En cuanto te sientas mal, dime. Pero no me dices.
¿Por qué no le dices que estás enfermo?
Para que no se preocupen.
Pero a veces nos mira pues tronando los dedos que a veces no hay. Y todo por las actas, ¿no?
¿Y conseguir las actas les cuesta también?
Porque se tramitan las dos. Creo que son como 3,000 pesos que pago cada vez que voy.
Y pues lo que se gana no es mucho. Aquí gana unos 200 pesos por día.
So, pagando 3,000 pesos para ir a conseguir las actas, cada vez que has ido, le cuesta más de un mes de empleo.
Sí.
Sí.
Today, the Mexican government estimates that almost 300,000 Mexican-American children, about half of all of those living in the country, are living without essential government services because they don't have Mexican birth certificates.
Hemos sido históricamente y masivamente un país de expulsión, ¿no? En ese sentido, el tema migratorio no nos había importado como país.
Mónica Jacobo Suárez is a professor at one of Mexico's most prominent research institutions. She's one of the few people who's been studying the surge in undocumented children.
Cuando tu acta de nacimiento no es mexicana, las autoridades quieren tener algún proceso adicional para ver que esa acta de nacimiento es verdadera, ¿no? Esto complica completamente las cosas.
2 years ago, Mexico signed an agreement with the United States to make it easier for these children to prove their dual citizenship. But Mónica says Mexico isn't doing nearly enough to actually implement any of the changes.
No basta con que lo saquen.
Sorry for, I just ready. I just wanted to stop it. Okay. Well, the video is available online if you wanna go and watch it until the end. It had just 2 more minutes left, but basically it sets the policy problem that we have for these US-born children in Mexico. And what I just wanna do here to conclude my participation is to kind of introduce you a very recent agreement that tried to kind of provide a response for this problem of accessing rights in Mexico. And this agreement that I want you to talk about was signed by the National Association for Public Health Services, Health Statistics and Information System. This is an NGO organization based in the US, and it was kind of interesting for me to understand that the registry of births in the US is not part of some kind of a government entity, as in Mexico is the case, but it's a network of local or state birth registries in the US. And what happened in Mexico, that was the huge problem in order for these kids to have their equivalent to the Mexican birth certificate, is that in order to do that, Mexican authorities require to see the original US certificate with a specific stamp, the apostille. I don't know how many of you know about the existence of an apostille. Maybe Marcelino can talk about a little bit later in the Q&A session. But basically, it's a seal that comes from one convention, the Convention of the Hague, the Hague, which basically provides a certification for a document, meaning that that document is valid and it's true. And it should be valid in very different countries that already signed that convention. So getting that seal once you are in Mexico, it's very difficult because that seal must be obtained in the original state where the child was born. And when the parents have been deported, as is the case in the example and the testimony that I already presented, getting that seal is very difficult and also has a cost that many families cannot pay. So what trying to do this specific bilateral agreement is to somehow waive or eliminate this requirement for the apostille. And in substitution of that, Mexican authorities can check with the US authorities if that child was effectively born where the family is saying that he was born. And this is done by sharing the data sets for birth registries in both countries. So this verification online program has been in place since September 2016, and it's been working really well in Mexico. The objective is to cover up to 200,000 children who currently are not having their Mexican nationality. We don't know how many of these children have already get their dual nationality. The Mexican government has not released any data on this. They actually say that this bilateral agreement has a confidential nature. So it's been very difficult to obtain any other information. But I just wanted to put it here as an example of how these two governments can continue cooperation in order to provide and secure rights for a shared population where they have responsibilities, the US and Mexican children. And just to finish my presentation and as a way to start the conversation and the discussion, I had this reflection for you. Because these US Mexican children have the right to come back to the US at any point in their lives. And we have been seeing for some of them, they already get to adulthood in Mexico, is that they actually come back to the US. However, when they come back, they don't have the knowledge of English that they will be needed in order to enter the labor force there. And many of them, they don't have any solid family networks back in the US in order to reintegrate. So apparently, this new population seems to be posing very interesting challenges and a need for bilateral cooperation between these two countries. And I would like you to kind of push you to think about in what other matters bilateral agreements will be needed in order to secure the access to all possible rights for this population in both countries, not only in Mexico, because as we have seen, we will be having this population moving also to the US, coming back to Mexico, and maybe moving also to the US. So this is a very new challenge that we've been facing. And I think that is a really good example to kind of show the importance of bilateral agreements between two countries that have been sharing migration for more than a century of years. Thank you.
Thank you so much for such an insightful presentation. And I think maybe compared to our last class on Thursday, this is a more case-based session. And I think it's very good now that you're most of you are maybe writing your final assessment. We talk now about the biggest consular network, about a case, the Mexican case study, Mexico-US migration case study, that is maybe the most representative in the literature on South-North migration. And I would like to briefly comment on this, on the virtues of dealing with case studies. saying that, of course, there is no universal or encompassing theory of migration. So concrete knowledge is absolutely valuable as a predictive theory. And the considerations that you find in the case studies are very important. And I know some of you are writing your final essays as a case study. I also like to defend case studies by saying that they are relevant to prove existing theory, existing hypotheses, but also to launch new ones. So please, please go ahead with your very specific experience. I know some of you work with migrants, have knowledge, field knowledge. Now, on what Professor Miranda taught us, he started on introducing the Vienna Convention on Consular Relations. This is very important, and I think it's important because it was released in 1967. And he said any country decides on its implementation, how far we go with this Vienna Convention. And of course, the question that has been put to us and asked so many times is this Vienna Convention enough for today's migration problems? I see some of the examples that you gave, both of you, are on bilateral agreements, not traditional ones, but bilateral agreements between states and NGOs. And that is something really new, having agreements with this track to non-traditional diplomatic actors. So this is something that we have to keep in mind. Bilateral agreements are not necessarily between states on a state level. I was going to ask Marcelino, what can bilateral agreements do for undocumented workers, for instance? If you can comment a bit more about it. How far can we go? And which are less successful areas, not only in the Mexican-US relationship, but in general? Which are the bilateral agreements that we would like to have, but we cannot have? And then we had this very interesting talk on the return migrants, so-called return migrants. But I would like to outline that this example that Monica gave us today is not necessarily a case of return. Many people study it as exile, because some of these people who are supposedly returned to Mexico never lived in Mexico, or they lived in Mexico when they were really small kids. So many people consider it a case of forced migration, and it's very important to be explained as such. Monica also emphasized the historical nature of migration. It's also very important to see that many of the countries that you are studying yourself have historical relations between the country of out-migration of the country of immigration, and that explains many of the flows. And one last idea before we go to questions and answers. I see some of the comments here of Ugo and Anil. I would say the US migration policy is, as many other cases in Europe, in many countries of destination, are systems that reproduce themselves. Therefore, when we see a change of administration, we don't necessarily see a change of migration system, because that is harder to change. That is more historical. And that is why, for instance, we didn't see a big improvement with the Obama administration, and we didn't see Finally, there was a catastrophic discourse on migration during the Trump administration, but we didn't see catastrophic returns. So it is a system that tends to reproduce itself, I would say. Maybe Professor Raj would like to comment on that later. But I will now take the questions that we have here. I don't know if Hugo and Daniel want to ask the questions themselves or I read them. Okay. So I'll go ahead and read Hugo's question. He thanks for your presentations. What could be considered the most important results for migrants? Is it money or knowledge of their migrants' rights? What actions should the immigration and diplomatic authorities take in Mexico? And then we have Anil. He says, what are the challenges in implementing bilateral agreements regarding migrants? A bit what I also asked. So if you want to ask ask more questions, yes, Pushpa also has a question. Have children or returning Mexican migrants under forced migration context been considered as equivalent to refugees? Okay, that is a very good question. So please go ahead, Marcelino first and then Monica.
Yeah, thanks very much. Let me just start with one thing. I'm glad that you mentioned again the Vienna Convention on Consular Relations. I think that that's a very powerful tool, but also could mean restricting the actions of a consulate of a country in another country. As we know, the Vienna Convention on Consular Assistance, one of the main on consular relations, one of the main points is that on Article 5, it says that consulates can have as a function helping and assisting nationals. So that opens a huge door, and every country can decide what they are going to consider what is helping and assisting. So I think that's a key part of the convention in which we can decide. I mean, a government can decide what they want to do about helping and assisting their nationals. But there's another side of this interpretation, and is that we are talking about nationals. But the problem or the challenge in the US is that we have people who have dual nationality. So if we have people who have dual nationality, then we can have some restrictions about what we can do in our consulates in order to protect those nationals. Because if we have a dual national, an American and Mexican national in the US, so we can provide some assistance, but not complete assistance, because they are nationals of that country. They are US nationals. So we cannot provide certain kind of protections because they are considered by their American government, they are considered their own nationals. So that's one of the first challenges that we should consider. And therefore, there are some of those people with dual nationality who are not protected by those agreements, obviously. Then the other thing is that the complexity of each family. And so in my experience, when I was in the US, the first thing is that we have, I'm just going to be a random example. So we have a father who is documented, who is Mexican national. Then we have the mother who was undocumented, Mexican nationals. And then they have probably 3 children. And one of them was born in the US and the other 2 were born in Mexico. And sometimes one of them was documented, but the other 2 children were undocumented, or probably one of them have dual nationality. So the thing is that it makes very complicated to provide certain kind of assistance or to implement certain kind of agreements in those conditions, because the local authorities could say, look, you cannot, you as a consulate or you as a Mexican government, you can't do certain things because these people are our US nationals. So that's a whole challenge. So so yes, indeed, we have agreements in order to provide assistance to undocumented migrants, but then we come to these challenges, as I mentioned, that families are very complex, and so the assistance that we provide sometimes is limited if we have dual nationals, or in the family, within the family, we have dual nationals. That's one thing. But at the same time, I have to mention also that the US government has certain programs to provide assistance to their nationals in Mexico. And that means, or that implies also the people who have dual nationality. One example is that people who were working in the US and are entitled to Social Security benefits, if they go back to Mexico, they are still entitled to claim those Social Security benefits. And the US government has a big office in their consulates in Mexico who are providing or who are assuring that those sometimes dual nationals have access to the Social Security services of the US, or they are entitled to. Okay, that's one for the first questions that you address, Camelia. And then you mentioned what we can do. I mean, what agreements we can have and what other agreements we cannot have. And I'm going to refer to what I said already, is that the agreements between countries are limited by this basic fact, that is that if you have dual nationals, sometimes it becomes complicated to implement or to set an agreement and to implement it, because in terms of, you can provide services to dual nationals, but in terms of protecting the rights, that's another thing. Because if you are a national and you are in your own country, you have access, or you should have access to certain legal services. But in that case, for example, if you are a Mexican with dual nationality and you are in Mexico, the US government or the US consulate cannot intervene to protect your rights because you are considered Mexican for Mexican authorities. That is the same thing in the US. If you have dual nationality and you are in legal problems in the US, and if you are considered a US citizen in the US, the Mexican consulate cannot intervene in order to protect your rights because you are considered a US national, even if you also have the Mexican nationality. And that becomes also a challenge in terms of protecting the rights of children, because there are many children who have dual nationality, but also at the same time we have this reality that is the protection of your rights or are defined by in which country you are. So that's one thing. And regarding the question about what is the most important resource, I would say I think it's Hugo who addressed that question. I think that the most important is knowing your rights. That's a basic and one of the most important resources that migrants have. If they know their rights, then it's more likely that they are going to be able to seek for assistance, and they would go to the right actors or to the right authorities, or probably they are going to just know that they are entitled to certain rights, because as Monica mentioned at the beginning, is that there are many migrants who don't want to come close to any official building because they think that they are not entitled to certain rights, or they fear any kind of authority. Even some organizations, as I mentioned, they tend to go to churches because they trust churches, but they don't trust any authorities. Even if they want to help, they reject any kind of assistance because they are fearful of everything because they are undocumented. So knowing the rights, it's a basic resource. I think it's one of the most important. Money doesn't really help when you are in trouble in the US, It helps for certain things, but it doesn't solve the problem. So that's the reason the Mexican government, our consulate, along with our partners, authorities and NGOs, we have an extensive campaign that we call Know Your Rights. And it's a basic campaign because people, even in their countries of origin, they don't know the rights and they don't know how to get assistance. Okay, so I would let it, I will stop there, Camelia.
Monica, do you want to answer?
Yes. Well, first, I would like to make a note on your really good appreciation about how US-born children are not considered part of the return migration technically. However, there is an interesting discussion because even though most of them have never been in Mexico before, some of them have been when they visited parents, extended family or their grandpas, because they have the documents to go back and forth on the border. However, the literature on children and migration actually consider this specific group as part of the return flow because they are minors and they belong to a returning family unit. So therefore, return migration directly affects them because they depend on their parents in order to get access to all those services. So that's the reason why we actually include them into the literature on return migration, even though the demographers will say they are not migrants, but first generation immigrants in Mexico. So just a note on that. And I concur with Marcelino in terms of what is the most important resource for migrants. I also agree that knowledge of your rights used to be more powerful and make a bigger difference when you are in Mexico. And I'm thinking on the different legislation and policy programs that the Mexican government has been implementing in order to support return migrants. And in many cases, families don't know about these programs. One example that is very, very powerful is that Mexican education authorities do not require the apostille on any education documents anymore. Students who are coming back from the US don't need to have the apostille on their identity documents or in their education certifications in order to enter a school here in Mexico. However, most families don't know that, and what is more dramatic is that most school authorities don't know about that either. So even though the implementation of this policy has been in place for almost 7 years, the first change in the legislation was made in 2050, 7 years ago, I still receive a lot of cases of families who cannot get their children enrolled in a Mexican school that maybe is in some remote place or in a rural setting. So I will say that having that knowledge is very, very important as a key in order to have access to rights in Mexico. Dissemination of any agreement, dissemination of any public policy at the different levels of government is also key, because it's not only the right and responsibility of families to know what are the rights and how to access them, it's also the responsibility of very different government agencies to be updated on these changes and actually inform families in order they can have those services in both places. I just want to touch on a little thing that Marcelino said during his presentation, but I think it's very important. He said that in order to have bilateral agreements or any type of bilateral cooperation or any type of bilateral program, you need to have political willingness. And I think that is very important to understand who gets the programs and who doesn't get any support. For instance, all these programs in education in Mexico have been targeted to US minors, US Mexican minors. However, we have a big proportion of minors who were born in Mexico, but they were taken by the parents where they're very, very young, maybe even before they have 1 year old. And for these children, sometimes they are not in the public debate in Mexico. They don't get into the public agenda in order to have specific programs designed for them. And why is that? Because they are Mexicans in Mexico. But for US minors in Mexico, we have the US Embassy speaking on behalf of them. So that's an important difference, right? Because they belong to the very same families, as Marcelino already said. They usually have a parent who is documented, a mother who is undocumented, and sometimes siblings who are dual citizens. However, they also get a different treatment in Mexico. So citizenship does matter. It doesn't, even if you are in the US or if you are in Mexico, citizenship makes a difference on what can you get in terms of right. And just had another comment on what Marcelino was talking about on the scope of bilateral agreements and on the scope of the Mexican embassy in the US. When can you intervene in some cases, and when the migrants can make use of one citizenship or another? And I remember that when I started studying the access to rights of the migrants in different places, I learned about some cases of US-born Mexicans who were in the US, but they actually make use of their Mexican citizenship to apply for scholarships provided by Mexican education authorities like CONACYT, the equivalent of the National Science Foundation in the US, in order to get to college in the US. You know, it's like me, Monica, I was born in the US to a Mexican father. My mother is also Mexican and undocumented. I never been in Mexico. However, my parents did the registration to the Mexican nationality in the Mexican consulate in the US, but I cannot afford going to college in the US because I don't have the money, and going to college is very, very expensive in there. So I applied to a fellowship provided by the Mexican authorities in my nature as a Mexican citizenship as well. In that way, I can get access to services that wouldn't be otherwise possible for me to obtain in the US, right? So it's kind of I just put that example. It's not like a very representative example. In most of the cases, we have people who doesn't have access to any rights or very little rights, both in Mexico and in the US. But I just wanted to put it there in order to show this very high complexity within the Mexican population in the US. Oh, and I see we have a very last question by Pusha Pareng. If children of returning Mexican migrants could be considered as equivalent to refugees. I would say that theoretically we could. However, I haven't seen any case like that in Mexico. I mean, I haven't seen any case framed like that by the Mexican attorneys that are providing services for return families here. But I think it would be a good a good argument to pose.
Thank you, Monica. Do you want to comment, Pushpa?
Yes, I just wanted to ask this because I feel like a lot of the children of returning migrants, in the case of Mexico, seem to be shuttling between nationalities. And while that is being settled, they are falling between the cracks, I feel. And my question was to understand if there are other kind of categories, especially because refugees have certain rights, and they are also shuttling between nationalities. They don't particularly, accept their birth nationality because of certain problems, that they have encountered, and they are still not accepted in the country that they have sought refuge in. So that was the reason, and I'm a little confused about why that line of argument has not been used, and maybe it has. I just don't know. Thank you.
Thank you, Pushpa. To my knowledge, it hasn't been used, and I think it's because in most cases, families have very little knowledge about how to defend the rights. And I think that in many cases, their main goal is to get their children the soonest as possible to school, the soonest as possible to get medical care. And I think that going for a line as a refugee or something like that will be something more contentious for them to do. And I think that in many cases, they just want to be accepted and have the rights that they are entitled to as Mexican. I've never seen like any families, at least in the cases that I've been overseeing and advising, I've never seen any cases where they actually want to be contentious or fighting for something. They just want to be integrated. However, I've seen cases of trying to avoid deportation of one parent when they are still on trial in the US, arguing that the US children would suffer a lot if they come back to Mexico, because we don't have any, for instance, any language transition programs in our schools. Our curriculum is basically based on Mexican history and not on US history. So we have many documented cases of a lot of stress, a lot of emotional suffering, a lot of trauma, and in many cases, even students who, after coming back from the US, they just quit school because they cannot continue with the bullying and the discrimination that they suffer by their peers and even by their own teachers here in Mexico. So sometimes attorneys have asked me to testify as an expert on these issues in order to try to avoid deportation while they are still in the US. But I haven't seen something kind of similar in the same line once they are already in Mexico.
Thank you.
You're very welcome.
Thank you so much. We have one last comment by Tinashe. Do you want to ask your comment, Tinashe? Ask your question?
Yeah, I think my question is pretty clear because the US, I think we learned in the past couple of modules that the US is not a signatory to the Global Compact on Migration. And I was wondering how this, or what you think the impact of this is on the safe, orderly migration, particularly of children, and whether you think the US becoming a signatory could also sort of improve the protection of children in this particular case. I mean, I don't know. I was just thinking that in the context of the bilateral agreements that we've highlighted, but I think there's this sort of big elephant in the room where the US is not a signatory to one of these conventions which seeks to improve the migration from one country to the other. So I don't know. I mean, it's just a comment question. I don't know what you guys think about that.
Thank you so much. Do you want to go ahead and give your
Yeah. Yes. I think that it would be great. It would improve a lot the protection of children and migrants in general. Obviously, but at the same time, there are some challenges within the U.S. One of them is that in terms of migration, we should also consider that the role of local governments of local states in the U.S. because they have different policies and different legislation in terms of migrants. There are some states who are very welcoming for migrants, but there are other states who have different standards, and they are even local legislation that do not protect migrants, and also they are directly targeted in order to affect the migrants. So within the U.S. the states are very different, and they have different legislation. So even if we have a kind of an agreement at the federal level, at the national level, that doesn't guarantee that migrants are going to be protected, or they are not going to be even attacked or discriminated in different states in the United States. Well, that's one thing. At the same time, I also would like to mention is that among the agreements that we have between the U.S. and Mexico, there are some agreements with immigration authorities in the U.S. that makes a more well-ordered, more or less, in terms of the deportation of Mexicans from the U.S. to Mexico. So we have an agreement, or at the same time we have different agreements with federal authorities, with the consulates, in order to for the deportation process. Mexican authorities are informed. They know exactly when those Mexican migrants are going to be deported to Mexico, in order to make arrangements about the transportation and about how they are going to be by Mexican authorities on the Mexican has been on for decades. So that it has been working in terms of, I think, that favorably to Mexican migrants, and that has allowed that we have a more ordered and humane, even if they are not signatories of the GCM. I think that other agreements right now in place between Mexico and the US that have allowed a more human process, and seek for opportunities in order to strengthen as much as we can, or to expand as much as we can these protections for migrants. That would be my answer, Camilla. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So I see we are reaching the end of the session. There are still a lot of challenges and questions that I would like to know about, and there are questions that maybe they are research questions. Like I was thinking, how can bilateral agreements be studied when they belong to secret diplomacy? Monica mentioned one of those, and I was wondering what happens when people don't have any nationality. What happens, so these are topics to think about, but I will now give the word to our Professor Raj, our part of our team, GRFDT team.
Thank you very much to both presenters. I enjoyed both presentations, and I'm sure others would agree with, even though Mexico presents a unique case because of the historical ties of Mexico with the United States. What comes to my mind is that these presentations have shown that we need to look at some of these concepts beyond the conventional understanding, because normally we say bilateral agreements are to dealing with the work of the migrants coming into another country, and therefore to facilitate what sort of possibilities could be created. And of course, more importantly, to protect these migrants, their rights in a foreign country. And a lot depends on what sort of resources consulates have and what sort of agreements are entered into. In other words, defining those agreements and the scope of implementing those agreements. I mean, these are very wide issues. So I think what these presentations, especially Monica's presentation, has shown, that these agreements are not just confined to our conventional understanding of protecting migrants, which is labor migrants, right? People who come to work in another country. But there are a whole series of issues here. Now you have the issue of the children. Where do they belong? And whether parents make the wise decision of sending them across the border and then they belong nowhere. Is that, is that the kind of life they should be expecting of their kids? Do they just say, okay, just go, now you're on your own, you'll be safe there without having status in neither of the countries? The other issue I wanted to just, so in other words, the concepts have so much fluidity and complexity that I think it's good to define right at the beginning that these concepts, they change. So our understanding of these concepts changes because the circumstances are changing. More issues, more challenges are coming into play. So that means more research, like Monica and others are doing, more research needs to be done and to create, to infuse those nuances in our understanding. That now it's not just agreement between two countries to protect just the labor, but it also includes children, women, it also includes other issues and so on. So the scope is widening, and therefore there needs to be more knowledge sharing about these issues. Professor Camilla, you mentioned that perhaps I should say something on how migration policies are, they tend to be reproduced from one administration, in the case of the US, to the next. Because the purpose of a migration policy, it's political, but it's not tied to a party, or it's not tied to a political administration, because there's a process. If you have to change the migration policy, you have to take this through all the various channels, whether it's the Congress, the Senate, the legislative, and so on. So that's a very long process, and often this is a political issue that most administrations try to shy away because they want to come back into power the next time. So they don't really change. And in fact, the purpose of this migration policy is to restrict the number of people who can come in. So I don't think one administration would be more generous than the previous one to say, okay, we can. What would open up the possibilities is how the labor market is calling for, where the needs are. And now we have to pay attention to the challenges of the nature of work and the nature of work in the 21st century and the nature of work in the post-pandemic and how it will affect migration and what sort of policies will be put in place in receiving countries. I think these are interesting issues. Perhaps we need to be looking at what are the post-pandemic challenges as regards labor market and the role of migrants in that labor market, overseas labor market, and to what extent sending countries are also thinking about how it is going to affect the people that go out to work and what sort of policies they will need to put in place to ensure that there is dignity afforded to their people when they go out to look for a job. And increasingly more and more undocumented labor is finding its way because they are just not finding any hope in either destination or sending countries. Sorry, I have just put in a whole lot of these things, and I'm sure researchers are looking into all these issues, but I thought maybe I will say something about that. And lastly, to Marcelo, what sort of the resources, because most consulates in other developing countries are not as well resourced as perhaps Mexico is. So they have not only the funding issue, they also have the manpower issues. And the point the case in point is the pandemic, the response of many consulates to this, to look after their people. And it was, okay, the pandemic came suddenly, but they were not ready. They don't have resources. So this, how much a consulate can do, who defines, and where there are a lot of migrants or immigrants, or migrants for that matter, or emigrants for that matter. And the countries are benefiting from those immigrants because they're sending resources, and perhaps they go out of their way to provide facilities to ensure that they are protected. Of course, that's not the case. So what I'm saying is that how well resourced these consulates are. In the case of Mexico, it must be. And where is that policy coming from? Do they feel that their immigrants are so important as a human rights thing, or do they do it because they are sending resources? So what is that feeling? I'm sort of trying to find out from Marcelino. I mean, you have the surety of the resources you continue to get, or do you have to partner with other agencies? As said, we do that with NGOs, which is very unique, that a consulate partnering with NGOs. I find this unique is great, but it's unique because you have your diplomatic, not restrictions, there are diplomatic lines. And I mean, you are not supposed to be siding with NGOs in a foreign country because you are there to do certain jobs. I mean, traditionally it was to issue passports, to issue visas and so on, and to protect your nationals. But of course now, as the migration challenges are unfolding and these complexities are known, then the jobs that consulates have to do is also increasing. But do they have the capacity, or are we paying lip service? I'm just trying to provoke here. And I mean, it doesn't require any answer, but just something to think about. Thanks so much. Sorry, Professor Camelia, when I speak, I speak. So sorry to have taken more time than I should have. Thanks a lot. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. These are excellent ideas. Maybe you want to take 1 minute each to answer, no more than 1 minute because of time considerations.
Yeah, thank you, Camelia. Thank you. Yeah, actually, even if we have a huge network of consulates, we don't have enough resources. I mean, it's the reality is that we will never have enough resources. So something that I think my colleagues and the Mexican government has been very, I think, innovative or creative, is that what we have done in order to multiply our efforts is to have established these partnerships with local authorities and with NGOs. That has been the key, because even I would recommend to other countries who have a limited amount of resources in their consulates, I think that they should take advantage of all these NGOs. And also I have seen political will from authorities in the US, and that could change in another country, but at least there's political will in order to protect the rights of migrants in their country. So what I think is that the best opportunity or the best chance that they have, that consulates who are underfunded, they have the opportunity to have these partnerships. And with that, you multiply the efforts, because then the actual work on the ground is going to be made by the NGOs, not by your few diplomatic officials that you have in your consulate. So that has been a key in our work at the consular level. And the other thing is that our diplomatic status, it could be restricted, but at the same time, it's an opportunity. And I prefer, as many of my colleagues see, I think that we should take advantage of our diplomatic status, because with that, we can force and we can push lots of things in another country, and it depends on your political will. If you are very creative and if you think in a very more flexible way, then you can use the diplomatic status in order to further and strengthen the protection of the rights of your nationals, rather than if you think in a very limited, and you think that you are limited by diplomatic rules I think that that could be restrictive. I think it's better to think in another way. Okay, that's it. Thank you very much, Camille.
Thank you. Monica, do you want to give a closing comment?
Maybe just reflect on the comment that Raj posed. I think that she did the very important question on considering the return flows. Like, it's not about what are we gonna do now, it's what is gonna happen with these kids in 10 years or 15 years. What are they gonna be going for labor force? Are they gonna be with their families? What we're seeing right now is that the policy hasn't changed and is still producing family separation here, there, beyond. And I think that thinking on the well-being of the migrants, the well-being of the families, it's the key question here. And how can we do that with the very limited resources that we have? And as Marcelino already said, we need to be creative. And many times that involves making alliances or collaboration agreements with many different actors, sometimes universities that collaborate with the states in the US. In my case, as I work the issue of education and migration, I've seen a lot of collaboration in the border cities of Mexico with US states in the border, like Baja California here and California, right? That they have already implemented a lot of very proactive legislation and normativity in order to facilitate the constant flow in the border of these young people. So I think that we need to think beyond the national entities, much more beyond that, and we need to be creative in order to collaborate and produce better conditions for our migrants in the world. And thanks so much for the invitation. I did enjoy it.
Thank you so much to our professors, Marcelino, Monica, Professor Raj, and for technical support at the GRADT. Thanks to our brilliant students who bared with us. I know it's late, very late for some of you. And I know that complicated issues cannot be solved with bilateral agreements. That's why we included a session on multilateral agreements. So please be with us on Thursday, next Thursday at 8 a.m. here in Mexico, 7:13 in India, and you know your times in any other part of the world.